Spanish conquest in the Americas enthralled the English crown and the aristocracy. They wanted what Spain had badly. Beneath the rivalry that consumed England, there was a strong desire to mimic Spain's successes. This aspiration to copy Spanish victories led English settlers in Virginia to assume things about the Powhatans, the indigenous people that inhabited the region, based on Spanish experiences. However, Virginia was not the Yucatan, and the Powhatans differed economically, politically, and religiously from the Aztecs. England's envy for its enemy perpetuated miscalculations and misinformation. Queen Elizabeth and her privateers intended to appear the better Europeans politically and religiously because they coveted what they believed Spain possessed. As a result, they missed opportunities to negotiate with the Powhatans as a sovereign nation. It was only when the hard knocks of Jamestown subsided, tobacco began to earn profits, and the mission to save native people from Spanish oppression ended, that England gained a foothold in the New World. Unfortunately, English success was at the expense of misunderstanding the Powhatans and dislocating its people. English navigation of the Atlantic and settlement in the Western Hemisphere were deviant reactions against Spanish dominance in the Americas and Catholic authority in Europe. Yet, by the law of relativity, the English failed to recognize themselves as transgressors. Advocates of these expeditions rationalized that their invasion served the ends of economic and religious justice for England. Richard Hakluyt urged Queen Elizabeth I to probe this frontier. Such venture would expand the power of the Anglican Church. Hakluyt predicted the native people across the Atlantic would be likely recruits who enthusiastically would serve as defenders of the Queen's faith. Elizabeth I, as the head of the Church of England, would benefit from the security of these potential supporters. These latent converts that Hakluyt speculated on represented a probable army of believers who would assimilate to English ways and reject Catholicism and Spain. Hakluyt lacked any concrete proof, but he still postulated that the natives the English would encounter would naturally despise Spain as the English did. If indigenous people failed to resist Spanish rule so far, it was out of fear, Hakluyt assured the Queen, since, quote, the Spaniards have executed transgressors most outrageously and more violently than Turkish cruelties in all the West Indies. Hakluyt portrayed the Spanish as more heathen than the Ottomans, and the people persecuted by these Catholics as eager as the subjects of the Ottoman Empire to, quote, shake their most intolerable yoke. Hakluyt similarly supposed that Native Americans yearned to convert to Christianity. This was the underground army of potential believers that Elizabeth I could depend on. Then Hakluyt shifted to economics. He warned and lamented how English trades are grown beggarly or dangerous because of the Spanish monopoly on Atlantic commerce. And this financial threat intertwined again with religion. Hakluyt explained, merchants to make ends meet would, quote, forswear and renounce their religion and conscience. The Spanish, whose gold and silver the English methodically plundered, Hakluyt contended, deprived the Queen of apostles. This was a fanciful way of justifying English piracy. and getting the English aristocracy excited about saving a people who Hakluyt argued yearned to be a part of England's dominion. The Spanish threatened freedom of religion and freedom to trade in one fell swoop. If Elizabeth I invested in the exploration of the Atlantic, this western voyage would earn England all the raw resources for Her Majesty's decayed trades. Moreover, it would employ idle men who lacked work because Spain restricted the progress of English markets. From Hakluyt's perspective, this Atlantic venture was essential for the religious, political, and economic prosperity of England. Virginia was a colony born from misinformation. The initial explorers that arrived to Virginia in 1607 meticulously had examined Spanish travel journals in the New World. They naively expected that the geography and the societies of this expanse territory would be uniform, so they expected to duplicate easily Spain's subordination of the Aztecs and Incas. The English commissioned adventurers and military men for leadership positions. Christopher Newport was a privateer. Before he assisted in the settlement of Jamestown, he raided Spanish ships in the Caribbean and Atlantic. Captain Bartholomew Gosnold was a pirate. Edward Wingfield and Captain John Smith were soldiers. All these men were connected with the aristocracy. They were leaders by birth, and the lowest of the men they commanded were laborers and convicts between the ages of 15 and 24. The middling people they administered were specialists: carpenters, masons, jewelers, barbers, joiners, and blacksmiths. Assembled to find riches, these 144 Englishmen expected the locals would supply their necessities. No one was prepared to farm. While at first the Powhatans did supply these foreigners with various food sources, their generosity tired. At the peak of Powhatan impatience with English incompetence and beggary around 1609, the local people would demonstrate their contempt by not just murdering English mooshers, but also filling the mouth of the slain, George Percy grieved, quote, full of bread, being done, that others might expect the like when they should come to seek for bread and relief. English trading habits appeared inferior and unfair to the Powhatans. They lost interest in such asymmetrical commercial relations. The English expected that the Spanish had more political and military control over the territories they settled than they actually did. King James I and his advisors instructed Captain Christopher Newport and John Smith to establish a settlement as far inland as the river allowed. If they established a town too close to the shore, the Spanish could approach and easily pull you out. The instructions warned that the French Huguenots, who settled in present Savannah, Georgia, made this mistake and paid dearly for it when the Spanish admiral Pedro Menendez de Avila, who had established St. Augustine in 1565, discovered the French Protestant colony and massacred its people. From the Spanish histories they studied, the English also learned how the Spanish appropriated the Aztec and Inca's economic and political bureaucracies. Thus, in terms of infrastructure, the Spanish did not need to reinvent the wheel. They simply took over the economic and political systems the Aztecs and Incas had established and perfected during their rule. The Spanish encouraged Aztec and Inca chieftains to continue the collection of tribute from their subjects, except now they funneled the taxes to the Spanish crown. This tactic saved the Spanish from having to make political connections with indigenous people outside the centers they conquered. It similarly allowed the Spanish an almost seamless transition of power. However, for indigenous groups who were less centralized, like the Powhatan Confederacy, matters were not as simple. Nevertheless, the English assumed they could appropriate Powhatan territory, along with their pre-existing trade and labor relations and political infrastructure. John Smith viewed the Powhatans as subjects of the Spanish crown. English settlement in Jamestown provided the Powhatans an opportunity to ally with England and gain security against Spain's tyranny. Yet this was the relative view of Smith. From the standpoint of the Powhatan chief, he intended to make the English dependent on the Powhatans. The Powhatans, like many other North American nations, had a tradition of recruiting the survivors of defeated enemies into their tribes. The adoption of outsiders helped maintain population levels. The process demanded specific rituals for these strangers to be reborn into the tribe. Many English assimilated into the Powhatan Confederacy. This was a response to the disorder and factionalism of the colony, the scarcity of food and women, and the unhealthy conditions in Jamestown. In 1608, John Smith ventured to meet with the Powhatan chief. When he arrived to the village, he was arrested and threatened with execution. This event would be the inspiration for the romance story Pocahontas. However, it is very doubtful that this 13-year-old girl would have been attracted to Smith. Pocahontas viewed Smith through the lens of her people's aesthetics. To her, this Englishman was pungent and ugly. The English had different hygiene traditions. While indigenous people kept themselves shaven and they bathed regularly, the English rejected such habits. Pocahontas stopped the execution of Smith as part of a diplomatic ritual to indebt Smith and the English to the Powhatans. As the English had their ethnocentric misconceptions, the Powhatans interpreted relations with these foreigners from the perspective of their interests. They had a desire to monopolize the loud weapons the English introduced into their lands. This would further secure their control over territory they struggled to consolidate politically, territory, ironically, that the English expected to appropriate automatically. The Powhatan chief gambled on Smith's sense of indebtedness to the Powhatans, as the English believed they were there to save the Powhatans from Spanish tyranny. So each side assumed the other owed debts. Pocahontas and John Smith never had romantic relations, yet the ritual from where this myth took shape was real. Pocahontas rescued Smith from symbolic death to solidify for her father kin and trade relations between the English and the Powhatans. Smith never quite understood the significance of this ceremony. Sometime later, the chief reprimanded him for his obliviousness to protocol. Smith only traded items he considered trash and the Powhatans lacked a need for. And yet the chief complained, quote, "You will have whatever you demand." The inferiority of English hospitality compared with Powhatan openness to English demands made the Powhatans resentful. English warmongering baffled the chief, who negotiated to avoid war, even though the Powhatans remained in a superior position in terms of supplies. As perplexing, the English pig-headedly traded worthless articles for food and reacted belligerently to Powhatan haggling. The chief rhetorically asked Smith, quote, "What can you get by war, when we can hide our provisions and fly to the woods, whereby you must famish by wronging us, your friends?" English obstinacy and short-sightedness increased Powhatan contempt. A gunpowder accident would debilitate Smith, who returned to England for health reasons. Without Smith, this strained diplomacy snapped. During 1609, new colonists arrived. With more mouths to feed and with weakened commercial relations with the Powhatans, the English faced starvation. The Powhatan had grown weary of the settlers' vain boasting. They expressed their disdain through violence. Villagers tied Captain Ratcliffe onto a tree naked after he kidnapped 2 Powhatan youths to exchange for food. They set him on fire while women, quote, "scraped his flesh with mussel shells." This was an ignoble death prescribed to miserly scavengers. The English were a greater threat to the English than the Powhatans during these hard times. The colonists lacked a sense of camaraderie. They hoarded food from one another. George Percy relates that Captain Davis at Algernon Fort was so well stored that they fed, quote, "crabfishes to their hogs." Percy lamented, "This would have been a great relief unto us in Jamestown and saved many of our lives." At their worst, colonists cannibalized one another, most of the time feeding on the corpses of the recently dead, but one man, quote, "murdered his wife, ripped the child out of her womb and threw it into the river, and after chopped the mother in pieces and salted her for his food. In this volatile environment, factionalism ensued. The colonists accused one another of being Spanish spies or of being in secret alliances with the Powhatans. Eventually, supply ships would arrive in Virginia, but not before more than 80% of the colonists died. This disorder instigated a reorganization of Virginia through martial rule. By 1611, Sir Thomas Gates and Sir Thomas Dale imposed new codes on the colony. If anything could be deduced from the laws they enforced, it appears Virginia settlers had lost respect for religious and political authority and avoided work. The codes demanded, quote, God be duly and daily served, and that they call upon their people to hear sermons. Another warned, quote, no man shall use any treacherous words against his majesty's person or royal authority. The laws also implemented strict work duties and the employment of spies, that is, quote, the most religious and better disposed to inform of the abuses and neglect of the people in their duties and service. For any who had read John Smith's reports on the Powhatans, that the god they worship is the devil, or that Indian men were often idle, the irony would have been apparent. While these new codes delivered some sort of internal stability to the colony, the marriage of Pocahontas to John Rolfe would reestablish friendly relations with the Powhatans. The discovery of tobacco by Rolfe in 1615 would create a potential source of wealth for the colony. Tobacco substituted for the gold and silver they never found. At this point, it was clear the Spanish model would not suit the English in Virginia. Rumors and reports of Virginia's predicaments and dilemmas made recruitment to the colony difficult. In 1617, the Virginia Company decided to offer 50 acres for all settlers willing to pay their passage across the Atlantic. In addition, 50 acres were granted to individuals who paid for other settlers' travel fees. The purchasers of this human cargo would profit from this investment by employing the new arrivals as plantation laborers for 6 to 7 years. This incentive of granting land was called the head right system, and the laborers they paid for to come over were indentured servants. In addition, the Virginia Company established the House of Burgess in 1619, a representative assembly of landowners which provided such property colonists limited authority in everyday decision-making. The Powhatan did not initially perceive the English as a territorial threat. Only about 20% of settlers were women during 1607 and 1619. To the Powhatans, the English appeared weak. They lacked the human resources to conduct the menial labor they considered women's work. The English understood their weaknesses relative to the Powhatans, yet even when they recognized where they fell short and when they strived to avoid conflict, they still misunderstood the economics of Powhatan life. The wide regions, unsettled by locals, were foraging grounds for wild deer whom the Powhatans depended on as a source of protein. The English settled these areas, arguing it was land the Powhatans allowed to sit unused. The Powhatans did not domesticate animals. English settlement of these lands, even though it was done in good faith, meant that the Powhatans would have to travel farther west to hunt, since many of the beasts they hunted would avoid the places the English made home. Similarly, English livestock tended to find Powhatan cornfields and feed on them. This interference with Powhatan food supplies were common grievances the locals shared with the English by the late 1610s. The English did not take them seriously. By 1622, the new Powhatan chief, Opechancanough, chose to terminate what he considered unfair diplomatic and commercial relations. He devised a plan to simultaneously attack multiple English villages and war on them so intensely they would retreat back to England. While the Powhatan's surprise attacks worked and they decimated English populations, the English did not retreat. Instead, they opted to transition from being bad neighbors commissioned by God to save the Powhatans from Spanish oppression to foreign invaders animated to totally wipe the Powhatans from the land of their forefathers. By 1622, 38 years after Hakluyt proposed England's western voyage to Queen Elizabeth I, settlement in Virginia had been achieved. The colony was 15 years old, but the argument that an army of indigenous followers desperately awaited England's reformed religion turned out to be wrong. In fact, in 1622, Edward Waterhouse reported back to the Virginia Company of London, a joint stock company that fronted the money for this venture, that while the land, quote, deceived not our expectation, but rather exceeded it, the savages, as the English perceived the Powhatan people, whose land the English invaded, instead of delivering that harvest which our pains merited, returned nothing but thorns, pricking even to death many of their benefactors. The report demonstrates English indignation at how ungrateful and unappreciative the Powhatans had turned out to be after the English attempted, quote, their conversion and safely sheltered and defended them from Spain. While Waterhouse's complaints can be interpreted as simple hypocrisy, it makes more sense to understand that the English from the beginning believed in the narrative that their explorers, adventurers, and settlers created about Native American spiritual and physical weaknesses, and that God elected the English to save the Powhatans, not just from their religious wickedness, but also from Spanish and Catholic tyranny. In this belief and misinformation lay the root of English anger and intention to annihilate the people whose land they possessed from a sense of superior civility and from a mission to save. For Waterhouse, that the Powhatans struggled to prevent the English from depriving them of this country, the Powhatans' lands, resulted from the instigation, quote, of the devil. This stubborn belief in English innocence worked to the benefit of the English declaration that while once their hands, quote, were tied with gentleness, now they had the liberty to war and destroy them who sought to destroy us. In terms of the profits Hakluyt predicted England would earn in the Atlantic, the Virginia Company of London had accrued only debt. Thus, in 1624, King James I revoked its charter and Virginia became a royal colony. From this moment forward, Virginia's mission would be to fatten the king's treasury by the production of that noxious weed, tobacco. This was a product labored over at first by the desperate and poor Englishmen and women who sold themselves into indentured servitude, and later by the African slaves who the English involuntarily forced across the Atlantic.